Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a una nueva conversación aquí en Congreso Futuro 2026. Mi nombre es Carlos Vázquez y hoy me acompaña una expositora de Congreso Futuro, Marie Bergstrom. Marie es socióloga del Instituto Nacional Demográfico y es una investigadora reconocida por sus estudios sobre relaciones íntimas, sexualidad y plataformas digitales que transforman la forma en la que los jóvenes se relacionan el día de hoy y construyen vínculos. Ha liderado y difundido resultados recientes sobre juventudes y vida íntima, incluyendo varios artículos sobre los vínculos, la diversificación de vínculos y las formas en las que los jóvenes están desarrollando ahora. Así que, hello Marie.
Hello.
Welcome to Congreso Futuro.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm delighted.
And welcome as well at this interview in TV.senado. For us, it's an honor to have you here. Like sharing your presentation and sharing what you've been researching about the youth and about how we relate, basically.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here.
So, in the past years, you've been researching and talking about how the young people is getting together and the impact of the platforms. Can you tell us a little bit more about your research?
Yeah, so I'm a sociologist. I work at the French Demographic Institute. So we do big population surveys, big questionnaire surveys where we ask people about attitudes, about behaviors. And so we do statistical analysis and we can see on a population level what are people doing and how is that different from what they did some 10 or 20 years ago. And so what I'm presenting here at the Congreso Futuro is looking into surveys about intimate relationships in France, but also in Chile. And seeing what the young people are doing differently from older generations when they were young. And there are actually quite amazing change. Yeah.
I can imagine, because everyone is talking about the young people those days, and I believe right now one of the main difference is the digital world and the digitalization of relationships.
Yes.
So in that sense, how do you believe, or how the survey shows that the digital aspect is shaping the way that the young people, but everyone is connected with others?
Yeah. Well, of course, the digital media has really changed quite profoundly the landscape of dating and meeting partners. Today, online dating apps have become the new normal. And this doesn't mean that a majority of people meet online. Actually, it's still a minority. That's the case in France and other European countries in North America, even in South America. You could say that today in most countries, the share of relationships that start online is about 20 to 30%. So it's a lot, but a majority of people still meet offline. They meet at parties and they meet through friends, at work and during their studies. But still, I mean, today when you're single, you go often online, and there's not only couple relationships, there are a lot of casual relationships. And if we go into what young people are doing differently, well, one of the main and big results we see, and this is true in Chile just as in Sweden and in France, it's that young people have more sexual partners today than yesterday. Before settling down, before eventually marrying, they have experienced and done experimentation, have different types of relationships, casual relationships, etc. And so the mean number of sexual partners has really gone up. I think it has to do with digital media. Online dating has made it easier to meet partners, but it's also that people, become financially and economically secure later on, right? So people get a first job at later ages, and they settle down at later ages, and so they experiment before they go into serious couple relationships and marriage. So that's a big change. Young people are more sexually experienced today than young people used to be yesterday.
And in that new experimentation, or in this experimentation, I assume there's some changes in terms of, I don't know, compromising with others or new forms of engage with that people. How do you, in your research, how you notice that? Is there, what is the change or the trend with the young population.
Yeah, it's true. We do see there's more partners, but also different types of relationships today. What we see, what I find really interesting, is that the younger generation. So these are people who are 18 to 29-year-olds today. They have a couple of relationships, but they also have relationships that they call sex friends or friends with benefits. These relationships that last sometimes, and they mix friendship with sex, not love and sex, but friendship and sex. And in Chile, this is really actually a country where you see this change. In a survey that was carried out by the Ministry of Health in 2022, they asked people about how would you describe your first sexual partner. And among the 18 to 29-year-olds, a third said, well, it was a friend or a sex friend. Whereas older generations almost all said it was a fiancé, or it was a pololo, or it was someone who you're going to marry, but it was more stable. And young people today have new types of relationships, and they have these sexualized friendships. And I think that's an interesting trend. It's new ways of being intimate with each other, new ways of building bonds.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned Chile, and I noticed that in Chile there's a lot of steps in order to formalizing something, no? And how is this different in other countries, or is this a trend that is the same in other parts?
I mean, of course, it's different in different countries, but I do think we see a trend where, as you say, more than ever, there's these different trends, which means that, I mean, if we do a generalization, we can say that the generation who were young in the 60s and the 70s, well, a lot of things tended to coincide. You know, you had sex, you were in a couple, and then you quite quickly got married. You know, all of these things they didn't happen at the same time, but, you know, they were quite connected in time. Now you have sex when you're young, and then you have a couple relationship later, and then you eventually marry. And so all of these different phases have been really extended. And so going into a relationship and being engaged with someone and going into a committed relationship is a longer process today than it used to be before. And this is something I think that we do see in different countries in Latin America, but you can see that in France as well, very much so.
Really, really interesting. And you mentioned there's now the people had more sexual partners, but what about the age that they start engaging with sex? Is that any shift on that? Or?
Yeah, well, actually, there's this common idea. People generally think that younger generations are having sex earlier. And actually, in most countries, what you see recently is a trend to the opposite. So when you compare generations born in the 30s and the 40s with those born in the 80s and 90s, yes, those born in the 80s and 90s had sex earlier than those born in the mid-20th century. But the last generation born late 90s or 2000s, they are entering sexuality at later ages. And we see this quite clearly in France, for instance. So it means that in the latest years, there has been a tendency to, you know, have sex when you're a little bit older. And of course, the COVID is an important factor. I mean, in many countries there were lockdowns, and in many countries there was a lot of anxiety, and so that can be a reason, but it's probably not the whole picture. It's also something about young people, the way they're socialized, the way they initiate relationship, that make them often have their sexual debut a little later, I mean a few months later, but still a little later than the generation just before.
It's interesting because it's counterintuitive, right? You think that people thinks more about sex, and you compare with music and compare with all the cultural movement that makes sexual something important in lyrics or everything. But it's interesting to know this that you mentioned. And what you think, in general terms, that is the reason? Because I'm gonna say something really, really true now, but it feels like now there's a shift towards more conservative youth threadwives in social media is a huge theme now. How do you think platformization or the platforms or the digital world shape these new relationships?
No, it's a great question and it's a complex one because really today we talk a lot about gender polarization and that women and men are becoming more different and that you have these very you have new conservative youth, but at the same time you have a very progressive youth, and so it's. I think what's important to see is that what you see when you look at political opinions and electoral behaviors can be quite different from what you see when you observe trends when it comes to intimate relationships. So for instance, when it comes to political opinions and electoral behavior, you do see this gender polarization in many countries where women and men are voting more differently and they have very different attitudes on a lot of things. But when you look at sexual behavior, actually women and men are becoming more and more similar, and they are both of them having more liberal sexual norms and ideas. So the conservative evolution and trend is not really something that we see very strongly when it comes to sexual behavior. Actually, for instance, there was a question that we ask often in surveys. I was asked to people who responded to the Chilean survey, also in France, is it okay to have sex without being in love? So is it acceptable to have sex without a serious relationship? Well, in 1998, when there was a former survey in Chile was made, it was a minority of young people in Chile who thought it was okay. It's like, no, it's not okay to have sex when you're in love. Today, it's a large majority to say, yeah, that's okay. And actually, there's a very few differences between women and men. So in that sense, both women and men are becoming more liberal, and the gender differences is really declining. So I think today it's difficult to say that we see one trend. We see a lot of very different trends, and when it comes to sex, it can be quite different from when you look at politics or other spheres.
It's really, really interesting that you mentioned this, because you think that political spectrum or sexual spectrum will be connected, but it seems like it's not the case.
Yeah, and maybe also I think that it's not necessarily a contradiction. Maybe we can also say that because women and men are becoming more similar in attitudes and behavior, because women have gained more power in society, have reached positions of responsibility, etc. Maybe that is why certain movements are becoming more conservative. So those would mean that the conservative trends is kind of a reaction to real gender convergence happening in other spheres. So maybe conservatism is, a political response to these big social evolutions that had happened, and maybe also a part of the population that think that we have gone too far, kind of. So, I mean, it could seem contradictory that people are being more liberal when it comes to sex and more conservative in politics, but maybe they are becoming conservative in politics because there is more, liberal sexual attitudes.
Everything is connected in some way. So let's go to a quick break and we come back.
Thank you.
Vamos a hacer una pequeña pausa y volvemos con estas entrevistas de Congreso Futuro 2026. Bienvenidos de vuelta a esta entrevista con Marie Bergstrom. Vamos a seguir hablando sobre relaciones, juventud y aplicaciones en esta edición de entrevistas de Congreso Futuro 2026. So, Marie, we were talking about these social changes and how the behavior change in the surveys. And I would like to ask, what do you believe is the main driver of these changes? Is there the movements movements like Me Too, for example, or more empowerment of women, or what are those drivers of these shifts in your work?
Well, I really think that when we look at sexual behavior and intimate relationships, yes, I do believe that one of the big forces that are driving this is the fact that women more and more are allowed to have relationships outside of marriage and to experiment. And I mean, I think the change is really tremendous because when you look at many countries, the norms that were prevalent in the 1950s, 60s, you know, there were many countries where you still expected that women should be a virgin when they marry. So there was a very, very strong control on female sexuality. And in many countries, we've seen a really extraordinary change throughout the end of the 20th century and the 21st century, where women are not only allowed, but are actually, you know, claiming the right to access other types of relationship experience without having a negative stigma around that. And that is a really big change. And of course, that is, you know, it's normative change, but it's very linked, of course, to socio-economic factors, because what has also happened during the late 20th century and the 21st century is that women have gained more economic autonomy. So, of course, that is a really important factor. So I think it's an error if we only look to normative change and it's like a change in attitudes and values. That is very true, but there are not change in values if there is not a change in living conditions and economic possibilities. And it's because we truly believe it's because that women have gained a higher social status and a greater economic autonomy that they can claim also autonomy and independency when it comes to the sexual sphere. So, I mean, these two things go hand in hand, right? But I don't think we can understand what sex is today, what intimacy is today, if we don't take into account this extraordinary, social mobility of women over the last decades.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because these shifts in the way women see or reclaim its sexuality or it's really important. But also I would like to ask about, for example, the LGBT community and the search of this new type. I will say new, but probably it's not new. The asexuals or the not interested in sexual activity or sexual engagement. How those changes happened in the last time according to your work?
Yeah, so there's been these new terms that we've seen, people identifying, as you say, as asexual, and so not having any attraction or desire for other people. There's been a lot of media coverage on the asexual community, but when you look at surveys, we see that the share of people who identify as asexual is a really, really small minority. It's so small that sometimes, I mean, it's really not a big phenomena. And so it's interesting to see there's been a lot of, this group has been very visible. Of course, they exist, but they are not very numerous. On the other hand, there's a big change going on, especially among the young, and is a really important rise in the share of young people who identify as gay, as lesbian, and more importantly, as bisexual. There is really today a growing group, especially of young women, who identify as bisexual. So just to give you some figures, 30 years back, it was a very small minority of young Chilean women and men who identified as LGBT. In 2022 was 8% of men and 13% of women who identified as LGBT. And in France, approximately the same year, also 8% of men and 19% of young French women who say that they are either lesbian, but most often bisexual. So asexual, very rare. It exists, but it's very uncommon. But on the other hand, we have a spectacular rise of young people identifying as something else than heterosexual, and especially young women identifying as bisexual. And I think that has to do with the feminist movement and Me Too movement. It's really, I think, also kind of like a political statement. It's a way of questioning gender, gender inequality, questioning heterosexuality, and not wanting to identify with heterosexuality anymore. So that's something that's changing a lot, and that's much more important than the asexual. Yeah.
And it's really interesting because it's something that always amazes me about surveys and about the sociology aspect of the study of society is how we believe something, but then facts tells a different story. So what was the most shocking thing that you said you believe that and then data show that it's not that way?
Well, it's a good question. I think what was I most surprised about? I think when it comes to sexual minorities, I wasn't surprised that it had gone up. But when I saw the results, when I just got the data, I was amazed by the fact that this is a minority that's a really big minority right now, and it went very quick because in France we can see that. The rising number of LGBT people, it really has happened since Me Too, kind of. And so I really think maybe I had not measured the effect that Me Too was going to have. But the survey results really told us that has been a very significant political movement. It has been a way to start talking about gender inequality not only in the workplace, not only, as violence or in the street or anything, but also in the intimate sphere. And for a lot of women, it's been really something that made them think about what they can expect from relationships, what they want from relationship, and what they want for themselves. And that has made a minority of women to kind of question heterosexuality. It might be women who still have relationships with men, but they're calling into question traditional gender norms in intimate relationships. Yeah.
Interesting. And there's a global, let's say a global problem. I'm not sure if I'm using the correct word though, but definitely population and the attitudes towards having children have changed. So how the young people in your surveys and your studies is responding to that? Are they wanting to go back to having kids or not? Or what are the big trends appearing in that area?
Well, I think that So I've insisted a lot on the fact that young people do things differently. But what you do see is that they are not rejecting couple relationships or family formation. Actually, a lot of young people, they want to meet someone. They want a committed relationship. They want this relationship to last. A lot of them want to get married, and a lot of them want to have kids. So it's not that the younger generation is rejecting or all the traditional norms and what their parents did. Actually, in some sense, they are very romantic and they are very much idealizing couple relationships. But it is true, though, that there's this idea that there's a lot of things you have to do before you settle down. You need to get a job. You need to get a place to live. You need to know about love. You want to travel. You want to sexually experiment. And so really the big trend is that young people today, well, they are older when they come to the point where they say, okay, let's settle down. And this has implication. It means that people marry later. It means some people will not have kids because, they are, for women, for instance, too old to have kids. So you have really big changes in this way. It's not that people are rejecting the traditional couple, but they're pushing it, for the future. And sometimes, they have more difficulties in creating a family or stuff like that. So I think that's an important factor to take into account.
And in your experience, what lessons we can learn for these surveys and for this understanding of how young people is looking love and family and everything with the way that the society is helping those young people to start living? Because it seems like more than the fact that I don't want to have kids, it's more like I don't have the capacity to take care of myself right now, so let alone a kid. So is there any recommendation on how we can use the information that you provide in your studies to, I don't know, develop a legislation that is more friendly with this with the young people?
Well, I really think that we need to think about when it comes to, for instance, the fact that fertility rates are dropping. You know, that's a big issue in many countries. And yeah, I mean, when policymakers look into that, a lot of time measures have to do with, you know, finding economic support for young people to have kids or to build families. I think that's very important, and we see that in many countries. If there is not childcare, and if there is not ways for women to work at the same time having kids, if there's not gender equality on the workplace, well, they're not going to have kids to the same extent, right? So of course there's a lot of economic factors, and policymakers can do a lot of things on that arena. But I think we also see now that it's not only about economy, right? It's also the fact that a minority, but still it seems to be a growing minority of young people actually envision the fact of, you know, living life without kids, and that it's okay. And I think that sometimes we need just to face it and to live with that. I think there is some demographic evolution that are hard to fight, and I'm not sure we should. I think rather than trying to make young people have more kids, I mean, if they want kids, you know, let's support them. But what if they don't? Well, then we have to make a society that is economically viable and friendly, you know, given the given situation. So kind of like accept the demographic fact that, you know, we're not in the society of the 1960s, 70s, 80s. It's a new reality, and we need to work around that and work with that.
So, just to wrap up this interview, the theme of Congreso Futuro this year, or the question we like to ask, is humanity, where we go as population. So, where do you think your research is going in the next years?
Well, I think that really what we see in the domain of intimacy is that the pathways of people are becoming much more complex. There are today very different ways of being in a couple of relationships. There's very different way of being in a relationship. There's very different ways of being a family, and people are single and they meet someone, but then they break up and they're single again. So there's much more complexity, and I think that, you know, that's going to be also an issue for us to see the trends and where are we heading. So yeah, that would be my response. I think we're going to, you know, see more and more diverse ways of what it means to be a human being and what it means to build relationships.
Thank you, Marie, for this interview, for talking to me, and muchísimas gracias también a toda la gente que nos acompañó en esta entrevista con Marie Bergstrom en Congreso Futuro 2026. Hasta luego.